Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Today we're going to talk about invisible disabilities and how they can best be addressed. My name's Frank Zacarri, and this is Life Altering Events. Some disabilities are obvious. People can see a child in a wheelchair. They can see spinal bifida. They can see cerebral palsy, and maybe even understand what the family's going through. What about an invisible disability? Something that's not obvious, something you can't see. I'm very excited about this show today. One of the most heartbreaking life-altering events is discovering that your child has been diagnosed with an incurable disease or disability. Then the fear and the panic and the questions set in. As a parent, your world falls apart. How did this happen? What did I do wrong? What can I do now? Who do I go to for help? Will my child need full-time caretaker? Then the anger starts. I will not put my child in a home. Will they be able to attend school? What kind of school? Will he or she be able to live independently? How will my child survive after I die? And I'm sure there's plenty others. Neurodevelopment disorders like autism or ADHD, which is what we're going to focus on today, ADHD. The outward signs just are not obvious. Now, we've all seen people react as if a child with one of these disorders is simply unruly or the parents can't control the child. Mm-hmm. These actions already add to the overwhelming stress that the family is living with. According to the CDC report, November 16, 2020, an estimated number of children diagnosed with ADHD is 1 in 6.1 million. It's 9.4%. This number includes 388,000 children ages 2 to 5 and 2.4 million children 6 to 11. And the rates are increasing on an average of 5% per year since 2013. Since 2003. Since 2003. Something is seriously wrong. Now, these numbers are staggering, but there's hope. And there's hope coming out of the research and testing and development at the University of California, Davis, from the Mind Institute. And today, we're blessed to have Dr. Julie Schweitzer, who is the Director, Attention Impulsive Regulation, AIR, and ADHD program at the UC Davis Mind Institute. She's also Director of Mentoring Academy for Research Excellence at UC Davis. And those of you around the country who are not familiar, UC Davis is one of the University of California, Davis is one of the top colleges in the nation for mental health and for neurological diseases, along with many other things. And we have Helen Zaccari. Now, Helen is retired Emeritus Associate University Librarian for Human Resources and Finance at UC Davis. Now, Helen is a parent who had researched and battled with schools for years on behalf of her son, Sean. Now, on a personal note, for the last 5.5 years, I have had the honor of being Helen's husband. So Helen, Dr. Schweitzer, welcome to Life Altering Events.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much for having me.
Dr. Schweitzer, let me start with you. In layman's terms, what is ADHD?
Well, the main 3 symptoms that we consider in ADHD are difficulty paying attention, so maybe very distractible, fidgeting a lot, hyperactivity, and having poor self-control, so poor impulse control. And these manifest themselves in so many different ways. So for the young child, it's really difficulty sitting in their seat, paying attention when you're talking as a parent or a teacher. But as they get older, they're not getting their work done. For impulsiveness, they may see a toy they want and they snatch it. If they're older, they may tweet something they shouldn't have tweeted. They may do other things on social media that they'll regret later. And then also we're learning more and more It's also people with ADHD tend to have problems with emotional regulation. So they have a hard time not just controlling their behavior and their thoughts, but they can be much more irritable, get much more likely to be upset, more temper tantrums. And this can be even as adults, you may see this. So this is all sorts of really negative manifestations, higher accident rates, difficulties maintaining relationships with friends as you get older, with spouses or on the job and so forth. They're more likely to get fired. They earn less money. They're less likely to graduate from high school, more likely to, unfortunately, not only become drug abusers, but also even really have, as I said, difficulty controlling their emotions. And so we've even seen higher rates of suicide. So ADHD sometimes is really considered, a lot of people think about the little boy who can't sit still in class, but that's just scratching the surface. There's a lot more that goes into this disorder, and more recognizing that girls as well and women also suffer from ADHD.
We've all seen and probably been in school with the child who is always fidgeting and tends to be disruptive. Now, you were involved, Dr. Schweitzer, in a research paper and talking about fidgeting. You mentioned that that's one of the symptoms, if you will, of this disorder. Now, what are you finding in this research?
So we found some evidence that fidgeting is actually not necessarily a bad thing. And the reason I even investigated this was that I was in this position where I was able to watch children with ADHD over extended periods of time, because many, many years ago, we had a preschool for children with ADHD as well as children with autism. And I saw that sometimes when the kids were working on their little assignments and playing, that they'd be thinking very hard, it looked like, from the expression on their face and what they'd be doing, but they'd be moving, they'd be wiggling a lot. And sometimes it seemed to me that the harder they were concentrating, the more they were wiggling. And I thought, well, we need to be able to measure this objectively. And so eventually, when I got the chance years later, that's what we did. We put actographs or actometers to measure movement. And what we saw was the kids who were moving more intently when they did so, the kids with ADHD actually had better attention. And so, for me, that was really a game changer, because I think, especially for many parents and sometimes teachers, they're really working hard to get their kid to sit still.
Yes.
And I can understand where they feel like maybe if their child isn't sitting still, that's disruptive. And that can be at times. But there are other times, if they're sitting by themselves or they're doing their homework and they're not disturbing anybody, my feeling is let them fidget, because perhaps it's actually helping them. And that's something that we're exploring now with a new grant that we were fortunate enough to receive, where we're going to be testing that. We're starting with adults, actually, and see whether natural movements actually help them with their attention and also help them regulate their emotions. And then I'm fortunate to have some collaborators at UC Santa Cruz who are Catherine Isbister, and Daniel Shapiro, who have developed an electronic fidget ball with sensors in it that's computerized. So we'll be able to see if one is giving something external to fidget with, whether that actually helps them. And we'll be videotaping the individuals as well. I have a very talented postdoctoral fellow, Sarah Colley, who's also has a lot of expertise in measuring physiology. So she will be looking at heart rate and so forth to see whether that's another way of looking at emotional regulation. If your physiology, you're able to control it better, and whether these fidget balls help, or again, whether natural movement also helps. So we'll be able to explore this and to see if it works, who fidgeting works for and under what conditions. And a long-term goal then would be that maybe we could help prescribe, essentially, make recommendations for individuals what type of fidgeting might be helpful for them and under what circumstances. So we're excited that maybe we can find some kind of new potential strategies to help people.
One statement that was attributed to you is that fidgeting often comes into play under circumstances where things are too challenging or too easy. Let me jump over to Helen here for a second. Helen, your son, our son, is outrageously high IQ.
Yes.
And when I read this statement from Dr. Schweitzer, when things are too easy, the fidgeting becomes more of an issue. Is that what you observed with Sean?
when I read your article yesterday, Dr. Schweitzer, yes, I made me pause and think about that. And I think so. I think he's, especially in math and the science, he, after being tested quite a bit for his abilities, the math teachers just said he sees the answer. So he was done, and there was this gap in time. And so it took a while as a parent to not try to dissuade him from doing things that I saw work. So I would come out when he was doing his homework, which appeared to me to be in theory, and he would have his Legos out and he'd be building things. And I'd say, Sean, you're supposed to be doing your homework. He goes, it's done. So I'd say, let me look at it. And it was done, and it was right. And so, yes, and in fact, that is an observation that over time, as when he became, a young adult, that helped guide him in what he wanted to do, which was technology. He said, I need to have my hands busy at all times. So that part of your article really resonated with me. And it was less often that I saw him with things that were difficult. And if they were, I never knew. He just seemed to take whatever it was. If it was me building something and saying, Sean, can you help me? I've done, this work. And he would just look at it and do it. So I think many things come very easily to him. So yes, I think there's this fidgeting, and unfortunately we didn't know that.
Reading the article and then knowing Sean, it was like, oh my God, I'm seeing a match here.
Mm-hmm.
And Dr. Schweitzer, let's go back to you. Are there any biomarkers or something that help you determine if a child at birth or before birth could be more likely to have ADHD?
Well, we don't have a biomarker per se, but we do know that it's very heritable. So if you have a father or a mother or an aunt or an uncle or grandparent with ADHD, you're much more likely to have ADHD yourself. And then we also know that if you're born premature, you're much more likely to have ADHD, or if you have low birth weight, which those two are related, you're more likely. There's also, we're learning certain environmental factors, though, that increase the likelihood of developing ADHD. So clearly we know for many, many years, if you have exposed to lead, that increases ADHD and affects IQ as well. And right now I'm involved in a really exciting project funded by the National Institutes of Health called ECHO, which is for Environmental Children's Health Outcome Study. And we have a site at UC Davis, but we're also linked to 35 other awardees, and I can't remember how many sites. It's well over 50. And our goal is to study 50,000 children in the United States. And because this is such a huge effort, we're able to pool information and data together. So we're able to look at things like whether nutrition makes a difference for the mother, what she eats, whether the fetus was exposed to things during development or during early development. Mm-hmm. And through that, we're going to be able to find out, probably really for the first time, because we'll have these kind of numbers, what sort of environmental factors might also interact or lead to ADHD. And the idea is, if we understand what in the environment might be more likely to trigger ADHD, then we can learn how to prevent it, which is really key, right? Because we don't want to just have to treat it. We want to find out if there's something. Maybe there's certain vitamins if the mother takes that reduces the likelihood of developing ADHD, or maybe there are certain things in the environment like phthalates. There's some evidence for that, plastics and so forth, exposure, that might increase it. But we're hoping over the next few years that we'll have some of those answers, which will be, like I said, even beyond a biomarker, but ways to prevent it.
Wow, that's incredible. Now, Dr. Schweitzer, what are some of the signs parents or teachers should be looking for, because you don't think, as a parent, you don't think your child does anything wrong, but there seems to be some issues. So what are the signs they should be looking for?
Well, these really have to depend on the age of the child. So when they're younger, what you see most are these observable things like the hyperactivity. So they have ants in their pants. They have a hard time sitting in their seat. They're not sitting still for circle time when they're in preschool and kindergarten. They're not following instructions. You have to repeat yourself again and again, whether to tell them to pick up their toys, or line up to go to the next, someday when kids are back in school.
Right, when they're back.
Right. But for older children, it's more the inattention, and actually it's the inattention that in many ways is the most impairing. And so the problems with attention, like not following instructions, as a child gets older, becomes more obvious that that's the problem. So they're not turning in their homework. They may even be doing their homework, but they leave it in their backpack. They forget to bring it to school, or hit the button to send to the teacher. They're disorganized, not just that they're messy, but they're not keeping track of things. They lose things all the time. If they have problems with impulsivity, and not all kids with ADHD have all these symptoms. They just need to have some of these for them to be impairing to meet the diagnostic threshold. But they might be interrupting the teacher, interrupting kids. They're speaking out of turn. You can see some of the same thing in adults. Again, with social media, they're tweeting, they're not thinking about the effects of their tweets on other people or on themselves and about the long-term effects. And when they are in adolescence, you really have to be more concerned about the impulsivity and not just the inattention, because that's when they can get engaged in some risk-taking that can have really lifelong impairing problems. So car accidents, that can be a problem. They have a much higher rate of car accidents, and that can be the inattention or the impulsivity, where they hit the gas without looking before taking off, or drug abuse, again, so forth. Again, not thinking about how that can impact them. And so all those are just examples of kinds of symptoms. In adults, it's much of the same thing. You may say hurtful things to other people, not realizing their impact. Speak out of turn. You're disorganized. You're not meeting your deadlines. Things like that. They have terrible problems with time estimation. They're not good at thinking about how long something's going to take to do. So they miss their deadlines, things like that. So It depends on the stage. For teachers, oftentimes it's really this disruption in class, but we do know that there are a lot of kids who have what we call the inattentive type of ADHD, where they're not disruptive. And there's a class within there called sluggish cognitive tempo. So they may look like they're daydreamy and not taking things in. So those kids are harder to spot, and they're usually a little bit older before they get diagnosed, but they're falling behind. They're falling drastically behind in getting their schoolwork done, or maybe doing things at work and so forth. And so that has a slow effect in terms of its impact, but it's just as bad, and it can result in not finishing high school, or eventually we actually see with adults they earn less money with ADHD, and they're underemployed. So even though they may be really bright, like Helen mentioned her son, it's not unusual to see people who are really bright, and even if they have a good degree, they're not earning as much money because they tend to go from job to job to job because they're not meeting the deadlines and so forth.
That's so interesting. As schools have attempted to not regulate, but maybe control. We've seen that with the balls where they sit on and the fidget things. Does that help?
Really good question. So we don't know. So that's why we wanted to do our study, is that a lot of people think they help, but we don't know if they help. And some of these things I think are just outright distracting, and more distracting than actually helpful. But we do know for years that teachers, special education teachers, and occupational therapists have done things where they've done things more subtle, like sometimes they have Velcro on a desk and the child will feel the Velcro. So it's something that's not so obvious to the other children, but having that external stimulation might help. Sometimes teachers give out chewing gum while kids are taking tests. So there's some motor movement that might be helpful, but again, it's not as distracting to others. So we don't really know for sure, but obviously there's this whole cottage industry that has developed that's selling these things and so forth and supporting them. And that's what we really want to find out. And our suspicion is that some of these things work for some people, but not necessarily for everybody. And so if we can figure that out and The fidget ball that my colleagues designed at UC Santa Cruz, Catherine Isbister and her group, it's not something that's really glitzy or super highly, it doesn't look like it's really fun, because we wanted to make sure it wasn't something that was so distracting that it would end up being more harmful than helpful. So we'll see, but we're hoping to figure that out, what works and what doesn't work.
Well, I have been, ladies and gentlemen, I've had the good fortune to attend several meetings with the Mind Institute. And if it's going to be found, they are going to find it. It will be found. They're incredible. Let me pivot over to Helen. Helen, when you suspected Sean had ADHD, there wasn't a lot of search tools back then. So what did you do?
Well, it definitely was a journey. Sean was diagnosed in first grade, and I remember receiving a single sheet of paper from the doctor, which was more descriptive of what we already observed and not too helpful in how to wasn't at all helpful in how to manage it. He did refer us to a child psychiatrist for looking at the medication alternative. And Sean was prescribed Adderall. But more than that, and that particular psychiatrist was actually good when we met. I think it was on a monthly basis because of the medication, to answer any questions that we had and give suggestions. But for first and second grade, Sean was in parochial school, and they were very cooperative, but they certainly didn't provide me with any information other than really good feedback on a daily basis if it was necessary. And then I, being the analyst I am, was able to summarize that and give that feedback to the doctor, which did modify how he prescribed the medication. But I think one of the most important things where I got a ton of information was, and I can't even tell you who referred me to this other parent who had a child with ADHD, and she just happened to be an attorney. And she said to me, okay, this is what you need to do. You need to get the following documents and study them, know them front to back. And that included the Individuals with Disabilities Educational Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act, relevant sections of the California Code of Regulations, and relevant sections of the Ed Code. Needless to say, I got a ton of information, and I did go about studying it. She also said and recommended some courses, which at first I thought, okay, they weren't the kind of academic courses I expected them to be. They were really hands-on. And so I learned everything from how to look at what seemed to be a straightforward assessment score and see how those were actually interpreted. And so therefore I could be on the same page and have a full understanding of what was in the evaluator's mind and have a more open, fulsome conversation. And it went to also a course which amazingly was one of the most productive and most used, which was how to develop a notebook that I took to every IEP meeting. And when I started out, I was IEP 504. What are you guys talking about? But soon that became part of my own language. But I took it to all of my meetings, and those courses really made me feel somewhat confident and provided me with a lot of knowledge. And as we already alluded to, Sean is bright. And so when we moved closer to our places of work, Sean left parochial school in third grade and came to San Diego Unified, which was right across the freeway from where I worked at San Diego State and not far from where his father taught at the community college. So he was closer at hand. And one of the first things they did was ask to do an assessment, and we said sure. And he came back in the upper 1/10 of 1% IQ-wise, and they placed him in a program I had never heard of. And it was called Seminar. And so within the school, each grade level had one classroom that had these gifted, exceptionally gifted individuals, but in different areas. Like I said, Sean is gifted in math and science. There was kids who were highly gifted in music and writing. And so that was a very good environment for Sean because it was stimulating. It ended up being, if you fast forward to the transition to middle school, we decided we needed to take him out of seminar because he was doing homework 7 days a week. They seemed to have a sense of brighter, give them more. And I think it was 4th grade, he typed up a paper that I still have that had citations in it, like college students, and he had to do the research. And I'm a law-abiding, rule-following person. And when the teacher said, you don't type it, you don't touch it. And it's 11 pages in 4th grade, typed with illustrations in it, and a page and a half of citations. And so it was too much. But because he was in this program, because I was brought up in a family of teachers, I firmly believe that the parent and the teachers are a team, and we have to work cooperatively together. So I became a member of the district's committee on the gifted and on special education. And those.
Helen, let me jump in here for a second. I understand you had a number of confrontations.
Yes.
Maybe hard discussions might be a better word.
Yes.
With teachers and school officials to secure legal and required accommodations. Okay. Yes. How was that experience?
That drew heavily on the information I learned. And I will say that, in the information I got, one of them from the seminar program was they eventually invited me to attend their teacher in service training, where I learned firsthand from experts. But yes, there was a lot of confrontation, and that was very unfortunate. And for example, our IEP meeting, which I have no idea the number of people who normally attend an IEP meeting, but our IEP meetings was myself. The principal was feeling quite threatened. And even though all I did was provide her with a parental view, and she invited the district's head of special education. There was the school psychologist, the special ed person at the elementary school, the teacher, and the teachers union rep. So needless to say, it was a very confrontational setting. However, the saving grace for me was the district's head of special education. At one point, she called me and said, Helen, are you aware that you're entitled to an ombudsperson? I said, no. She said, okay, here's the list of experts that are part of our team. I chose the attorney. Then after a particularly ugly meeting where the school psychologist, if for lack of a better term, seriously misbehaved and showed almost a complete lack of understanding of ADHD and a very rigid temperament, she called me and said, are you aware that you have the right to remove anybody from the team? And I said, I choose the school psychologist. So elementary school had its ups and its downs. And in fact, after 3rd grade and 4th grade in seminar, I got tired of trying to make sure they actually implemented all the agreed upon accommodations. Threw up my hands and filed a grievance with the state Board of Education. And I won, and they got a reprimand and were told to immediately implement them. So yes, to say it was confrontational was pretty clear. 5th grade was better, much better, and middle school was a dream. When we took him out of that San Diego Unified and moved him to our local school, oh my God, the most incredible team of 2, special ed, and the principal. Principal was super involved, super proactive, super innovative. I later found that one of the special ed individuals was actually an adjunct professor at San Diego State and taught the master's program for teachers getting their special ed credential. And she came up with amazing accommodations.
Now, this is to both of you, but I'll start with Helen. Young children do not want to be singled out. They don't want to be singled out that they're different. So How did you work with Sean to alleviate this concern, and did he fight you?
Well, I don't know that we ever alleviated that concern to this day, but he hated being removed from the class for a period of time to go to the nurse's office to get the medication. And, just because, as Dr. Schweitzer has described, some of the behaviors associated with ADHD, he felt different. And to this day, he will not take even an aspirin. He hates medication. And he's very adamant. In a recent conversation, he was saying there has to, health providers need to look to other things too, and not just simply medication. And, equally passionate about people being adequately informed and trained about how to manage individuals, to help them with ADHD. And so he didn't fight me. I never heard a complaint from the nurse. However, I think when we weren't the caregiver on site, that I do remember him spending the night with his cousin, and my sister the next day saying, I watched him take the medication. However, I found it in the seat cushions of the couch later on. So, not overtly confronting them, but he had his methods. And so yeah, he fought it, not me or not the nurse, but it has had made a lasting impression on him to this day at age 30.
Dr. Schweitzer, in your role and capacity, when you hear this, because you must hear it a great deal of time, what suggestions and recommendations do you make?
Right. Well, we particularly hear this during the adolescent period. And so first of all, a lot of what I do is I try to make the child or the adult, whoever has ADHD, really a partner, and try to come together to see what they can do that helps make them feel like they have some choice and they're at some agency, that they have some control over it. So when they're younger, medication is more easily accepted at some point, but still you always want to find what their strengths are. I know, Helen, your son has a lot of strengths. Mm-hmm. And so is there something that they're really good at, that they shine at? Because a lot of it also is there is so much focus on what they're not doing. And they get so much negative feedback. So if you can find something where they shine and they have a passion, and oftentimes these kids, they may not be doing their assignment with their chores, but they're doing something. And if whatever they're doing, see if they're passionate about it and if it somehow can be reformulated as a positive. So that's one thing. Find something that they like to do, that they're good at, their strengths. The other thing is work with them again as a partner. So for teenagers and young adults, what I've said to them is, okay, go off your medication. Let's do a trial where 1 week you're off your medication, 1 week you're on your medication, or maybe even at different doses of the medication. And let's see how productive you are. Let's have a scientific approach, because the nice thing about the medications is that they're very short acting. So you can do those kinds of things. So I've done that not infrequently, especially like I said, with young adults, maybe college students. But the other thing is to look at what sorts of strategies are they willing to try. So there's lots of evidence now that exercise can be helpful. So considering about how you can strategically exercise, so not just fidget, but exercise before you have to pay attention to something where you need to have high focus. Have them do a schedule where they look at not just for time management, but to learn when are they most alert during the day, what other circumstances help them be most productive and so forth. What are the kinds of things that help them with their impulse control? There's a lot of people who have had a lot of interest in meditation and yoga and the Zata strategy that helps them. So it's really trying to, whatever age they are, trying to work with them. And trying to be partners. And I try to teach them how to be scientists, essentially, to really look at in a very systematic way, one of the times when they feel like they're more in control, they're happier, they're getting things done. And again, and that, of course, we should include the parent. Unfortunately, people with ADHD don't always have the best insight. It's interesting when you see people in their 30s and 40s and they start to have children and they have ADHD and they see their child has ADHD And that's sometimes when it really hits them, that they need to do something about their ADHD, because they realize that they're now responsible for somebody else.
Right.
But we want to catch it earlier, right?
Yes, exactly.
Much earlier. And so again, trying to work with, now that we know a lot more about how the brain, we do a lot of brain imaging research in my lab too. Now that we know how the brain even works harder. So people with ADHD, it's not like they're lazy. It's not like they're unmotivated. They're working oftentimes twice as hard, and we see their brain activity actually shows that. But how can we reorganize what they're doing to help them meet their goals to make them happier?
That's outstanding information for parents, teachers, and everyone in the world who's watching this. Now, Helen, you were still working at a very high profile and a very high stress job when you became a member of the Mind Institute board. Why was this so important to you?
Well, as I have some of the things I've previously said, and our discussions with him as a fully formed adult, that, his impressions and how, I saw the not so good experiences in elementary school and the wonderful experiences in middle school. I have always been passionate about ADHD. And also my focus has always been on that part of the spectrum of services where the experts come together with the individuals. And I know it's critical to do the research, et cetera, but that's the point in time where my passion is. And it's probably because that's kind of where I lived. I wasn't the researcher and the scientist. And so I had the good fortune to work at UC Davis, and I had heard about the Mind Institute. And fortunately, on the very first meeting, we got to meet Dr. Schweitzer. And so I really cannot say enough about UC Davis. And being now on the committee, I have, to a person, only seen the most kind-hearted individuals, without exception, starting at the top. And so I knew I'd come to the right place. And, Dr. Schweitzer, you really are inspiration. And so couldn't have asked to have a better person with whom to work. So very, very lucky in those regard. Yes.
Well, ladies and gentlemen.
Right back at you. Thank you. I really appreciate your support. It's really terrific, and I very much appreciate it. And I know parents and teachers of others and individuals with ADHD really appreciate that they have somebody like you who is so passionate about it. It makes a big difference.
One of the things that I've seen, ladies and gentlemen, with the Mind Institute, so if your child has one of these invisible disabilities, contact them. I was fortunate enough to go with Helen and Sean when we met Dr. Schweitzer. And the difference that I see with her and the Mind Institute, most researchers are just looking at the data. Over here, they want the individual to be involved.
Mm-hmm.
So how can you treat something if you don't have the individual who's impacted being engaged? And this is what they do there.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So, ladies and gentlemen, as we've said through almost an hour here, neurological disorders have a devastating effect on everyone that it touches. But today, our idea was to give you hope. And if you don't believe that angels walk among us, then you have never interacted with a researcher like Dr. Julie Schweitzer or a loving and committed parent like Helen Zaccari. They will never give up, ever. Now, we're just about out of time, ladies and gentlemen. I want to thank Dr. Julie Schweitzer and my wife, Helen, for sharing this story. And I'm sure it's going to inspire thousands and thousands of people around the world that you're not in this alone, and there is help. And no matter what life throws at you, and it's going to throw a lot at you, please do three things. Please look up, get up, never ever give up. Pick up the pieces if you have to and keep moving forward. And better times and better people will come into your life.
Mhm.
If you'd like more information about Dr. Schweitzer, the Mind Institute, you can contact them directly, or you can come to me and I'll make sure that it gets to them. You can see this show on the Life Altering Event channel on Roku TV or on my YouTube channel. If you go to the YouTube, please subscribe to the YouTube channel if you would. I will also send links to Dr. Schweitzer and to the Mind Institute and to Helen, and they will post it where they put out their information also. So this will be available in a number of different places. Now, let me leave you with this. None of us are in this alone. And the secret to walking on water is to know where the rocks are. And today, Dr. Schweitzer and Helen Zaccari have shown us where many of those rocks are. Join me again next week, and we'll have another life-altering event. Thank you.